Hello and welcome to C Notes, the podcasting division of the Anti-Money Laundering Training Academy, found at amltrainer.com on your internet dial. This episode of C Notes, called Cops to Compliance, is being brought to you by Kevin Sullivan, the president of the AML Training Academy. In today's episode, I'll be interviewing Don Temple, a retired IRS agent, and Gary Clement, retired Royal Canadian Mounted Police. You know, every time we're at some of these seminars and whatnot, it's the one question they always ask me, and I'm sure they do with you guys too. How did you get to where you're at? What led us from being a cop into being an AML guy? And I do notice all those phony baloney certifications above Gary's head there. Who's he kidding, man? He's printing that down on his computer. You know. All right. I wanted to start with an intro of you guys. How did you guys get involved in financial crimes? Don, you want to go first?
Sure. Don Temple. I'm a retired IRS special agent. I began my career as an auditor and ended up as a special agent. And since then, I've worked for an AML software vendor, a bank, one of the big four accounting firms, and now provide anti-money laundering consulting services.
How many years did you spend with the IRS?
As a special agent, 26, audit 3, so roughly 29 years total.
What does a special agent do with IRS?
A special agent conducts criminal investigations of the tax statutes. And it's not just always legal income. About a third of the cases that we work were narcotics investigations, quite a number of fraud investigations, and then probably or a third to half of the investigations related to legitimate income. In other words, someone made $1 million in a legitimate source of income, but only reported $15,000 on their tax return.
Outstanding. And Gary, how did you start out in this business?
Well, 34 years in law enforcement, but started out like the majority of RCMP have to. You end up in Regina and boots training, and then it's out in the field, and most of us had to do a stint in uniform. For me, I believe somehow naively that if I got into narcotics early, I could actually make a difference. And that's why I use the term naively.
I know that feeling, yes.
The quick route to it in the RCMP was to go undercover. You go through a series of tests. I went into the undercover program, and that's how I embarked on a career initially in drug enforcement. And then after I finished a very long undercover operation in British Columbia, there was a contract put out on me, and the Queen decided to move me to Fort Puzzle, affectionately known as RCMP headquarters. They felt it was safer. I'm really not sure on that, but we'll go there another time. I went through all the trials, and that had been my second long-term undercover operation. And about halfway through, I can remember sitting there and saying, this sucks, because here we were putting people in jail, and Don, you'll know this about Canada back then. We never touched their assets. So if somebody had $2 million, they went to jail, they probably ended up coming back with more than $2 million because they didn't waste it on anything. And that, for me, is very frustrating. And so I had a great boss, and he totally agreed with what I was trying to say. So we started what we called back then the anti-drug profiteering, and the rest is history. It proceeded from there. And at that time, I also, because I was sort of disillusioned with RCMP and the way they had treated having to move undercover operators, I also decided that I thought of quitting, but I realized the only thing I could do was real estate or private investigations. And so I went back to university and realized I wanted to get into financial crime, and pretty well stayed in it the rest of my career.
Good. Gary, you talked about the going to prison and not seizing assets. We used to have a little slang term for that in the U.S. If they did the crime, they could do the time, because when they got out, they could come back and enjoy the fruits of their ill-gotten gains.
I totally agree.
Yeah, I remember in the States, the prevailing wisdom years ago was you arrest somebody on an A1 felony. Say he's got 20 kilos of coke. It's going to be an A1 felony. He's not going to do any more time. He's got a life term right there. So the theory was, well, why spend the time, effort, energy, manpower, and money putting together a money laundering case when the guy's not going to get any more time? Until they finally realized that key words called asset seizure. And then things started to change a little bit with that. Because there's nothing better than taking the bad guy's money from them and using it for the good guy. I put my 2 cents in on how I was brought up. I started out with the New York State Police in uniform patrol. Got involved in undercover narcotics, just like Gary. Thought it was going to make a difference. To my surprise, didn't. Well, it was at the time of Miami Vice was on TV. And I thought for sure I was going to have a Ferrari Testarossa and going to drive around the neighborhood like that. And nah, I got like this 1972 beat up Chevy Camaro. And it just, apparently my thoughts of being Don Johnson didn't work out that way. I mean, we were doing street buys, Gary. So we were like the
Right.
low level stuff. And we kept going to the same locations time and time again. And it was easy pickings, shooting fish in a barrel. And we make a lot of arrests, but nothing ever changed. Now you go back there 2 weeks later, same thing's going on, same neighborhood. It doesn't get any better. And I remember
Yeah, you get that right.
I remember opening my big mouth to the boss one time and said, "Hey, boss, we never seem to accomplish anything by doing this stuff. What is that money laundering stuff I always hear on TV? Follow the money stuff. What does that mean? Can we apply that here?" All that was important to him was like getting the numbers, is getting another scratch. If he's a lieutenant, you want to be captain. If you want to be captain, you want to turn major.
Right.
And that's how you do it by moving up, is getting the numbers. And he just said very sarcastic to me, "Yeah, Sullivan, why don't you take care of that?" And so that's got my Irish stubbornness up. And I said, "Okay, you son of a gun, I will." And that's where I started to read up on money laundering, and that's where I too went back to grad school and did a economic crime management and got involved with CFEs, and ACAMs just came to be. Next thing you know, I'm involved in this stuff, and before I know it, I'm with the El Dorado Task Force. I get assigned down there. It just was before 9/11. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, and suddenly now money laundering and terrorist financing became a real big thing. Put myself in a position to be in the right place at the right time. That leads me to our next question for you guys. Did the job provide you with any training, or did you have to do a lot of this on your own?
Good.
We did have an undercover training course. We spent 6 weeks, and you were sent out and made to do things to see how you react and how you can handle stress. So from that perspective, that was pretty good training. Reality is, though, all the training in the world can't change your personality, can't change how you act, and really can't change whether you've got the ability to work undercover. Not everybody can, and that's no fault and takes nothing away from them. I think you got to be 3 parts crazy and have a death wish. But that being said, I still think it was one of the most effective. I did a lot of teaching on what we called cold approaches. And I know you guys know what that means. You find a target, you get some background, you do a cold approach.
Yep.
And I used to watch Geraldo all the time, the investigative journalist. And I watched what he was doing. And that was what I did in my training was, if he can do this, we have more information than he has access to. Why aren't we doing it? And that actually became one of the fortes. I just loved a con artist. And you either become good at it or you become dead. I mean, it's one of the two. I enjoyed doing the con and concocting all these wild stories because, let's face it, everybody's different. Every criminal is different. And you've got to really establish some creds with these people. And the crazier you appear, the more creds you have.
I remember thinking that, man, this is like being in the movies. Because I'm just acting. I'm just kind of creating an image. When I was making buys, I was just too big a guy. I didn't look like a crackhead. So I had to play the roles. One day I'd be a construction worker, and I'd dress up like that. Another day I'd be a biker. I put some leather on, put some colors on the jacket. And before long, they were just throwing drugs at me. And I said, this is pretty cool. I get to act and do anything I want. If there was an Academy Award for undercover stuff, we would have got it, Gary.
Yeah.
But
I don't know about that, but
we would have got something. But
yeah, exactly.
The fun part of it, but it's also, there were some very harrowing moments with that, and just wanted to, let the folks know that certainly the three of us have joked many occasions about this stuff, but it can get awfully darn serious. And you even mentioned it, Gary, about you got to be part crazy to do this. I mean, there are some instances that I think I aged a few years in a few minutes with that. So do you guys have any story you want to tell on what your most harrowing moment?
Go ahead, Don.
No,
Done? Crashing through a door?
I guess my most harrowing moment had absolutely nothing to do with illegal income. It was a regular tax case. And it's the only time I've ever been involved in a shooting. We had a guy come in and he was being interviewed again about his tax return, and there was a warrant out for him in the city, and city police came out and they were going to arrest him, patted him down, and after the interview they were going to handcuff him and take him away. Well, during the handcuffing, or just prior to handcuffing, they handed him his personal things back. He went to put them in his pockets and he bent over, and I thought, what the heck is he doing? And he came up with a gun and put it right up to the head of one of the police. and started screaming to the other officer, "Give me your gun, give me your gun." And the two policemen fortunately had signals worked out. So the guy that was being held dropped down, and his partner shot the guy. I would have bet he was gone. I would have bet he was dead because it was a good clean shot. Guy survived and wound up being prosecuted, but that was probably the only thing in the way of Harrowing. I never, like you guys, I never was an undercover. I didn't think I would really be that great at it. You know, one of the guys attempted to be an undercover one time, not so much in an official capacity, but he used his first name and a false last name, and he was signing a document at a financial institution. He signed his real name, so I thought that would be me. So maybe it's better I don't become an undercover.
Yeah, you do have to remember all your cover names and hope you don't run into somebody.
That was 40 years ago. We still rag him about it to this day.
Gary, you must have had a couple.
I had several, but one that stands out was through my own stupidity. After coming back from my undercover course, I went right back to the original detachment that I had both policed in uniform and done drug work. And this is a case of, like probably yourself, I came back and I thought I was Miami Vice after the training. And
Yep.
so they had an individual they were after for marijuana. So I said, I'll just meet him. No problem. I can buy off this guy. No intro, anything. I met him, said, yeah, no problem. I'll take you to somebody else. So I conned them very well. Should have known at that point is I busted a lot of people in this town. I think it's time I probably quit, but no, ego took the better. And we went up, knocked on the door. Of course, I got a baseball cap on and it's backwards. And the guy comes out and says, "What the hell are you doing here, cop?"
Oops.
And the second guy that was there was this very large black gentleman that probably could do push-ups on one finger. And I think at that time I was about 185 pounds. Next thing I know is I am being beaten. And I'll never forget a young lady police officer that was the first in our detachment. She might have been 115 pounds. She came in, jumped on this guy, and I'll tell you, I thought she was a tiger. She literally had the three of them standing almost bare butt in about 10 minutes. But I'll tell you, I ended up in the hospital over it, but it was a wake-up call. Probably smartened me up and made me do a better job. But it proves that it is a serious business. You can't get cocky, and you really have to listen to your cover team, because if you don't, you end up dead.
Oh, you're right. You know, we've had a couple of situations. We had a IRS undercover in Miami who got stabbed, I think 20 or 30 times, fortunately survived. And in Baltimore, we had a Baltimore city policeman who was an undercover and was in to do a buy. And we have no idea to this day what the bad guy or what the narcotics trafficker was thinking or what triggered him. But he shot the undercover and unfortunately killed him. Some of these things, I wasn't there for that one, but even if you're not there, it's pretty sobering, believe me.
No, I agree with you.
Yeah, it has moments. I remember I used to always be afraid of the dogs when we do a raid, because these dirtbags would cut out the vocal cords on the pit bulls. So that when you try to do a raid on the house and you tinkle the doorknob a little bit, normally a dog would bark. You come to my house, you know, my dog's going to bark like crazy if someone pulls up. That's why they cut the vocal cords out. And you go through the raid and you open the door and there's two pit bulls biting your legs. And that kind of stinks. And the last thing you ever want to do is shoot the dog. But amazing how quickly you'll do that when he's biting your leg, though.
Tell you, Kev, a cattle prod, the real cattle prods, you can retrain a dog in about 10 minutes. We hit a guy's place and he had 2 attack Dobermans trained. And we hit the door and he ordered them to attack. And when the sparks start jumping in their mouth, all I had to do after that is point my finger and go bzzz, and they go lay down.
Now the good people from PETA will be protesting this podcast.
We didn't shoot them.
Hey, that's right. I mean, our only option was shooting them at the time. Yeah, I never thought of a cattle prod. I had a stun gun, but it didn't seem to be too effective. But, well, the whole reason I just wanted to speak about this, that this is where when somebody at the bank, some analyst is sitting there, he gets an alert, comes across his desk, and he thinks it's just, some computer-generated thing that now I need to check this box, do that box, and send it down the line, and I go to lunch. And I just want people to understand, especially people new to this industry, to understand, where this stuff comes from. It's like all the stuff that we did, that Gary and Don and myself have done, that's what causes those alerts to come out. Those are the bad guys that are doing bad stuff, making profit from it. Now they got to launder it. So when you're sitting at the bank as an analyst and a young investigator at the bank, and you get these monitoring alerts or triggers, it came from something. There's a reason why it triggered. There's a reason why it came out. And there's a reason why these bad guys are laundering their cash. And there's some really bad stuff. And some of the stuff we saw was some really bad things. Not just the drug dealing, but the homicides that went along with it, and the human trafficking that went with it, and a gazillion other things. So I just want everyone to understand when I talk about money laundering and why it's important, this is why it's important. Because if we can put a damper on the money laundering, you put somewhat of a kibosh on these bad things that they do.
Kevin, one thing I've said it over and over to analysts and mid-level managers and banks, if all financial institutions, and then we included our gatekeepers and that, lawyers and accountants,
right,
did their job, maintained credibility, we actually could put a damper on money laundering. But there's way too much complacency. Government hasn't, in my view, taken it as seriously as they should. Right. And as a result, we have tax havens, a few still kicking around, even in our own backyards, and money laundering running rampant. And the sad thing is, I think the three of you probably agree, if we were to sit down and try and figure out what we accomplished actually in the fight against money laundering, it would be pretty dismal. So thank God we didn't get bonuses based on accomplishments of shutting the world trade down.
Yeah, but unfortunately, people did get bonuses for the exact opposite.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's part of the problem. Yeah, I was going to say this for the last question, but since you brought it up, I know that FinCEN is now requesting people to send in their statements on possible changes of the regulations. And I guess that's a direct result of the FinCEN papers that came out several months back. And I was just trying to think what changes I could possibly think that they could do. I know the one change that I want to see is put people in jail.
Exactly. You just hit the nail on the head.
These big white-collar criminals, they can't live in an 8x8. That's just not their thing. And once you start putting the first one or two in there, a lot of this stuff will stop. So that's my belief anyway.
Also, Kevin, we need to hold bank management accountable, CEOs. With these stories of these banks and their ongoing mistakes, we'll call it that, somebody's at fault here. And what we do is they pay a fine. It's a deferred prosecution agreement. And they still get their bonuses and nothing changes. I've said many times, I know, Don, one time we were on a panel together when I said, nothing's going to change until we see a banker go out in handcuffs at a senior level. Yeah. And I know there was quite a stir in the room. I'm writing a paper right now and I'm looking at it. And if we look at our whole money laundering industry and everything that's happened in money laundering, most of our associations, the vast proportion of people on them are the big banks, and they're the ones that foot the bill for most of these associations. So as a result, we don't get candid enough with the weaknesses that the financial community still holds.
One of the problems in defense of the banks, I think, and the other financial institutions, well, actually, one thing I wanted to mention first is that a while ago, I have seen a few DPAs where they talk about clawing back bonuses, which I think is a good idea.
Excellent.
But, one of the problems, and I've seen this because I've done this since 1984 when I started leading the Financial Investigative Task Force in Baltimore. As we identified people involved in illegal activity and how they were conducting the transactions, for example, one of the very first cases was a guy who went from branch to branch to branch of the same bank and deposited $9,000 or $9,900 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day. Well, the bad guy said, can't do that anymore. So they would open up 8 accounts at the same bank and deposit the same amount of money in different branches, but into different accounts. Then we get into things like microstructuring and things of that nature. So the bad guys, they continue to learn from their mistakes, and they keep making it more and more difficult for financial institutions to identify activity. But Gary, going back to what you said, one of the things that does concern me is I know I've heard from some friends in the industry where banks were under DPAs. They got out from under the DPA, and then they started cutting their staff. It's sort of like, well, we dodged that bullet, so exactly. To keep spending all that money. I just think that's kind of dangerous and probably not a good idea.
I was working for one of those large banks. I'm not going to mention the name.
No, me neither.
Just in case they don't want to hire me again. As soon as the DPA was over, I was gone. They cut back their staff. All the amount of training they were doing got cut back. And I said, my goodness, they're just going to go right back to doing the same things that got them jammed up in the first place. Yeah. So I figured,
Exactly.
well, I'll give them a couple of years and they'll be hiring me back again. When you read what the banks say about, the SARs and it's too cumbersome and law enforcement doesn't do enough with the SARs and they're trying to back the way out of it and too many CTRs, they want to raise the amount of money to have it for CTR requirements. The message the banks are trying to put out is that a lot of the information isn't being put to good use. So when you didn't know any better, you'd almost feel sorry for the banks. That they have all this effort to do, and why are they responsible for doing the government's work? And then, of course, you start to look at their profits, and you realize, come on, with all the fines that they got, they still managed to screw things up. They still managed to, and not enough to screw up. Sometimes it's absolutely on purpose to get that profit, putting profit ahead of security.
I agree with you on that.
How much profit do they need?
Exactly.
How many trillions of dollars do they need to make? It's just a shame. So I'm very interested to see what the results of this FinCEN questionnaire is going to be. And I guess the final submission date is, I think, middle of November. So I don't know how long it's going to be before they come out with their report on it. But I'd love to see what they plan to do or how they're going to do it. Are they going to put government folks in with the banks, which I don't see that happening?
No.
Going to use some government money to supplement the bank AML programs?
Well, Kevin, the Bank Secrecy Act, there's actually a section in there to pay bonuses or rewards to financial institutions who provide information that leads to forfeitures and seizures. Yeah, but it's never been used. It's never been funded. And the problem is, when you have an obligation to file a suspicious transaction report or a suspicious activity report in the U.S., it's kind of hard to pay someone a word I'm looking for. Oh,
Finder's fee.
Finder's fee. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. That's a good one. Thank you, Gary. When you're just meeting your obligation. The other thing I wanted to talk about, you mentioned CTRs. I'm hearing from more people, even people outside of financial institutions and outside of government who are, I think they've gotten to the point that they agree that there's really no reason to change the CTR $10,000 threshold. And I don't think there is. I don't think it should be, because even though 10,000 is nothing like it was in 1970, I don't know what 10,000 from 1970 would be today, but let's say it's $40,000 or $50,000. The point is, most legitimate businesses and people, they're paid, with direct deposit, or the money goes onto a prepaid card, something of that nature. So, back in the 1970s, so many people, on Friday afternoon, their boss handed them an envelope with cash in it. We don't have that today. So I don't see any reason to change it. And I was kind of glad to hear this, because what some of the people are saying is that the CTRs are almost automatic. The banks have software that automatically generates CTRs. And if you change the threshold to 30 or 40,000, this was my argument for the past several years, basically then you start structuring at 29.9 if the threshold is 30. So It's been my thing all along. So I hope it doesn't get changed. I don't think it should be changed. And one of the things I think, Kevin, that could come out of this is, sort of a way of implementing or integrating a risk assessment into your transaction monitoring. I don't know how difficult that's going to be. I think a lot of financial institutions depends on their transaction monitoring. I don't know how easy it would be to merge the two or implement the risk assessment into the transaction monitoring.
That's a good point. One of the things I hope FinCEN addresses, and COVID has really shown all of us, is we're entering a whole new world with the cybercrime.
Yeah.
And it just shows how criminals and terrorists have adapted real quickly. I think they've been there for a while. My big concern, and I can't speak for the U.S., but I'd be surprised you're any different, is going to be the inability for law enforcement and prosecutors to take this on. Because, as you know, and Kevin, you just did an upgrade on blockchain and cybercrime. Yep. You talk to most law enforcement, and they're miles behind. And the shortfall in having somebody with cyber skills, right now, I think it's worldwide about 800,000 people. So I think it's going to be really interesting the next 5 years with this new technology and how people are able to adapt, including financial institutions, because they're not much farther ahead.
Yeah, you got to, and then add the marijuana onto the top of that. There's going to be a lot more things that banks and law enforcement's got to look at. In the age of defund the police, where's the manpower coming from? Where's the training come from? My job didn't train me at all. I mean, we did undercover training, but as far as the money laundering stuff, they never sent me to a school. They didn't send me back to grad school. They didn't pay for anything. Everything I did was on my own with that. I mean, the feds did when I was with El Dorado, they would send me to like the ACAMS conventions and things like that. But so where is the funding coming from the police to train their people? Do you expect to get kids right out of college? Why would a kid become a cop for $75,000 when he can work for Google and make 150 right at the door?
Yeah.
So there's things that need to be addressed and updated there. So with that, I just wanted to ask, how did you guys make the transition from police to banking world? And how did you find that? Is that a little awkward? Or I know there's certain things that I found very interesting. The lack of camaraderie was one. Because if there's one thing that I missed most about the police was the camaraderie. I missed that a lot. I mean, sometimes the police can be one big locker room, whether you like it or not. That's kind of how it was. But that doesn't fly in the private world. Oh no. I've learned to keep my mouth shut most all the time. No sense of humor, no nothing. Just do the job and to get out.
We refer to it as turning over a new leaf, Kevin.
Is that it? Yeah. So it's not easy. Any advice for someone who might be leaving law enforcement and going to come into the world of banking?
Yeah, I'll start off. And first thing I would say, I think I've been able to witness that it's not every law enforcement officer that can make the transition. And the fact that you're a law enforcement officer does not necessarily mean you're going to be selected. And that's the key.
Yeah,
it comes
those
down
days are gone.
Long gone. The things that people are looking for, and what worked for me is, if we're a police officer that was a go-getter and you'd like to go out and take on investigations and had a bit of an entrepreneurial bent, you'll probably survive and make the transition fairly easily. If not, you're going to be working for a company and back to almost being a beat cop where you take direction and go do files. Because that's really the two. And, I hate to say it, but I've experienced this with the private investigative side of a firm. There's very few law enforcement officers that really do well in the transition. They're great at it if you hand them a file and tell them to go do A, B, and C. But as far as being entrepreneurial and digging it up, it doesn't work. And the only other thing I'd say is we're in a world of ongoing learning. If you are targeting finances, keep your skills up. I don't care and I'm very much like Kevin. I didn't have an organization paying my way through. I wanted to do this, and I wanted to be in a position to tell them I got the skills. You can't take it away from me. And I think that's what it's all about, in keeping your skills up. And as you know, very much like you, I still do it today. This is a changing world, and it changes quickly.
Yeah, you got to take the bull by the horn yourself. If you're on the job, you're a cop, and you think that you're going to retire tomorrow, and all sorts of doors are going to open up for you that on subjects and matters that you have no experience at whatsoever, it's just not going to happen. Maybe that happened 50 years ago, but not today. You better start working on yourself and pulling out the wallet from your own pocket. And what was that line that Benjamin Franklin said? Investment in your own knowledge is your best investment. Or no, investment in your knowledge pays the best interest.
Sounds good.
Correct. Yeah, that's it.
Perfect. And he's absolutely right. So, Don, any?
Yeah, I'll go back a little bit further, because in my case, we used to say in law enforcement, I'd rather be lucky than good, and I've been pretty lucky for my entire career, quite honestly. If either of you remember this, it was kind of jokingly said, but also very true. Back in the late 70s or early 80s, the way a BSA officer became a BSA officer at a financial institution was he walked by the boss's door one day. The boss said, "Step in here. What are you doing?" Right. "Congratulations, you're now the BSA officer." They had no idea what BSA even was. I kind of felt that way when I got the financial task force. I was asked to go in and work, and back then we called it the Title 31 project. And I thought, my God, who did I make angry now? And I cleaned that one up for you a little bit so you wouldn't have to edit it out. But so here I am, I'm now in this Title 31 task force. Fortunately, we had worked a case with Customs. A guy made the mistake of selling a kilo of heroin to an undercover customs agent. So you can tell how far this goes back. I didn't say HSI, I said Customs. And the guy we were looking at, one of the main guys, was dumping cash like it was going out of style. It was $9,000 transactions all over the place. So I had a little bit of experience with CTRs and, the failure to file with CTR. But one of the things I found that worked really good for me, and I did have to pretty much teach myself, was working with other people. Back then, the chief of IRS CI, back then it was called the deputy commissioner, Dick Wassenauer, was very involved in developing the money laundering statutes. And he had a staff, and I went to meet with a couple of the people on his staff to get an idea what they were looking for with the 1956 and 1957, the two money laundering statutes. And I tried to take that information and build a little training course. And I used to call banks and ask them, hey, would you like me to come out? I'd like to come out and, maybe do a presentation. The way I did kind of a history of the Bank Secrecy Act and the various reporting and record keeping requirements, CTR and CMIRs and currency and monetary instrument reports for transactions when you're leaving the country or returning with over $10,000. The 8300, I called it the businessman's CTR. But talk about all those. And then I had case examples that fit into each one of them. And invariably, when I did one of these presentations, you'd look at, you'd have 50 or 100 people from the bank sitting there, and you'd see the deer in the headlights. And I said, I'm going to be speaking to someone when we're finished. And sure enough, we'd come up and say, never really thought about this, but let me tell you what happened recently. Or you get the phone calls, and the biggest problem that the bad guys have, they cannot explain where the money came from. That's their biggest problem. And the best example I have of that, and Kevin, you've heard the story, Gary, I don't know if you have or not, but it was the first case we developed after I started leading the task force. We were at CPE in College Park, Maryland. There's a great pizza place down there. It's called Lido's. Best pizza in the world. This isn't a paid advertisement, but they just love their pizza. And you guys can look at me, and I bet you both know that I haven't missed very many meals. And what really
I wasn't going to say it, but I know Gary was.
What angered me, once again, Kevin, I've cleaned it up for you. What angered me was that just as my pizza was delivered, and this is back before cell phones, my pager went off. I thought, what the heck's going on? So find a phone, make the call, and Mr. Temple, this is Mary Smith at the ABC Bank, and we just had a guy come in and buy 2 cashier's checks for $196,000 in cash, and we're suspicious. I'll be right there. So drive up 95 and into East Baltimore and walk into the bank, and we're talking to her, and they counted the money, and it was $196,000 and change. And I said, well, what is it that made you suspicious about this? She said, well, this guy came in, he's a customer. He was in, a raggy t-shirt, raggy jeans, raggy sneakers, and he had $196,000 in a gym bag. And, you're thinking, I don't know too many people dressed like that who'd be carrying that kind of money. And I said, well, what else happened? She said, well, we were sitting down and we needed the information to fill out a CTR. So I asked him for his name, address, his date of birth, his social security number. She said he had no problem giving me that. She said, but one of the questions on the CTR is, what's your occupation? And she said, he sat there and he thought for a minute and he said, I'm in real estate. Well, real estate isn't an occupation. She said, what do you mean real estate? She said, this idiot had to go back into the think tank. I started thinking again, scratching his chin. He said, I'm an investor. She said, I didn't believe it because he didn't look like a real estate investor. And finally, when she asked him the last time, he said, I'm a dealer. Now, I'm here to tell you the guy was a dealer. He just wasn't a real estate dealer.
Right.
And we brought in a drug dog. And back then, and even up until the time I retired 19 or 20 years ago, we used drug dogs. And I'm here to tell you, I don't believe all money is tainted with narcotics, because in that particular case, we took the money, we put it in several packages, put it around the room. We also used new money from the vault. And dog didn't hit on anything but the suspect money. And, so we made a few phone calls and found out that the FBI had received an informant's communication about this guy. And he started out with marijuana. He was graduating into coke. And the reason he came into the bank was because he was at the airport. And I think it was an airport in Atlanta. He was going from Baltimore to Miami. And he didn't have a suitcase. He just had a little carry-on bag, like we used to call it in the Navy, a ditty bag. And he walked up to a guy. Now, why he would do this is beyond me, because he walked up to a policeman with a drug dog, and he's asking questions about the next flight to Miami. And the officer got engaged in a conversation with him, realized he didn't have any checked baggage, just had this one little carry-on, and the dog alerted him to the bag. And he said, oh, do you mind if I look in the bag? Well, he didn't care because he didn't have any drugs, but the bag was loaded with cash. And the officer said to him, he said, my God, where'd you get all the money? He said, oh, I must have picked up the wrong bag. That's not my money. So the policeman said to him, well, I'll hold on to it until the rightful owner comes to claim it. With that, when he went back home, he got back home, he called his attorney. He said, hey, listen, you can't be fooling around with this stuff. You need to at least file a tax return to report your income. So the guy actually went and had a return prepared. he was buying 2 cashier's checks. It was April the 14th. One was payable to the state of Maryland and the other to the Internal Revenue Service to pay his tax liability for that year. So once again, the problem is I can't explain where the money came from.
Yeah. One thing I do have to help you here, Don. You said pager. For most people in the audience, they won't know what that is.
Oh,
well, that
probably
was
true.
pre-cell phones, and that's when you had to go into those Superman boxes and actually dial a phone.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of people won't even realize that, but police work without the cell phones, as we didn't have them back then. And when they did, you had to have an extra person along to carry it. It was different times.
Well, Gary, the only thing I think I need to say about that is you use the term Superman, and I want you to know I've been called a lot of things, but Superman's not one of them.
and let's be real here. When Don first started out, it was the Pony Express. That's how you got met. And the telegraph wire. ...
Yeah, actually, Don and I met when I was on the March West.
Well, you know the story of how the first time I met Gary is up at the Akwesasne Nation Reservation, which borders Canada and New York State. And I had no idea that they had Native American reservations in New York at all. I think it's like 1990, I guess, around there. Yeah. They're having some big problems up there because half the natives wanted gambling, half didn't want it, and they were fighting, and shooting began with that. So because the reservation actually covers more land in Canada than it does in the U.S., they had to call in law enforcement. And, of course, you know, they'd send us up for we would go for 2 weeks at a time, I think, Gary.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we always be running into the RCMPs or Ontario Provincial Police. And, of course, being cops, at the end of the shift, there was only one thing left to do. So we'd all meet up at some local, watering hole.
Yeah. We referred to it as a cool container of liquid refreshment.
Yeah. And then on the weekends we'd have a softball game, the Americans against the Canadians, and it's just the way cops acted with each other. I don't remember actually meeting Gary there, but I know that when we spoke about it, we were there at the exact same time. So I know we had to. So Don just had a good story. My last question was going to be, give us one story, either a funniest story or an interesting story.
I got into the story and I got away from how I got into the public sector. If you want me to, I can go on with that a little bit. I worked with the task force for 16 years, and I think I got to know and understand the Bank Secrecy Act pretty well and the anti-money laundering statutes. And I would encourage anyone in law enforcement who would happen to see this to work with financial institutions, get to know them, and share your information. Offer to do training for them, and you'll probably see that it'll pay off in rewards. But how I got from law enforcement to the private sector, I'll never forget it. Sitting home one Sunday evening, it was about 8 or 9 o'clock. It was in the summertime, and the phone rang, and I answered it, and the fellow with a real thick accent said, "Mr. Temple, we'd like to speak to you. We need someone with your expertise, and we'd like to hire you. Would you be willing to come and interview with us?" And I'm thinking, a good friend who'd like to play practical jokes, and I thought I was playing a practical joke, only to find out or remember. Thank God, because I was getting ready to light this guy up. But thank God, I remembered that about a month earlier, someone, a senior executive with IRSCI in the national office and headquarters, had called me and said, "Hey, I understand you're eligible to retire. Would you be interested in another position?" I said, "Very possible, something that would work out. I'd love to at least talk to someone." So that was it. That was a Sunday night. Thursday, I did 5 or 6 one-hour interviews, was offered the job, and started worked there for a few years. And then I got recruited by a bank to do some work with them, and got recruited by the Big Four. So that's why I'm saying you got to be good. At least I hope you have to be good. I think it was pretty good at what I did, but you also have to have a little luck as well. And hopefully, if you're interested in pursuing this, you'll have some luck to go along with expertise and knowledge.
Well, what did I say about luck? You create your own luck sometimes. You put yourself in a position to be lucky.
Exactly.
All right. So Gary, got any good story to finish out with a good story, and I'll throw one in.
Probably one of the ones, and I can laugh about it now. It wasn't so funny at the time, but one of the things the RCMP had a set policy on was you can't front your money. You're going to do a drug purchase, but you can't front it. Mm-hmm. But that was done by a bunch of people in headquarters that had never done an ounce of operational police work in their life, and they came up with that policy. Well, it got known on the street that only cops don't front money. And so throughout our whole operation, we were fronting. And I don't know the amount. It was maybe a quarter pound of cocaine at that time in the early 80s, late 70s. Mm-hmm. And I fronted the money. And I had gone through a guy who was still seated in the car with me, and he had gone to his supplier, and hour after it was fronted, the allotted time, they didn't show up. So I didn't say anything. I got out of this Cadillac I was driving and got the tire iron out and went back and laid it on the console. Never said a thing. Mm-hmm. Anyways, next thing he says, you got to drive to this address. We'll get this looked after. So I drove to the address. And the next thing, this young girl, which turned out to be the supplier's wife, is being yanked by the hair, and he fires her in the back and he says to her, before he does me, I'm going to do you. Now I'm thinking this is not going to go well in court. So I turned to her and I said, look, you got nothing to worry about. The only thing I'm interested in is I got some money out. I understand it's your husband. I hope he does the right thing. And he did, and it all got resolved. But I was thinking at the time, holy crap. And this guy was capable of it. He had a violent record. And these are the situations people don't realize you get yourself into. You laugh at them afterwards, but at the time you really feel the sweat rolling down your back.
Yeah. It was always not at the moment, but when it was over, that's when I started to sweat and realize how close I came to no longer being here. But at the time, you're just thinking, I mean, your mind is, I guess, like the guys that come back from battle in the service. All their senses are so alive, and they can hear things, they see things, they smell. And that's what's going on when you're in those situations. And because once it's over, then you realize, holy crap, I came about this close.
Kevin, do you have time? I can tell you the story about the Irving Graven.
Oh, yeah, that's a great one. Tell us that story.
Well, I was sitting in the office one day, and I got a phone call from a bank who said that there was a guy who was going to different branches. He always went to the drive-through window and he deposited cash anywhere from $1,700 to over $9,000. And this had gone on for a couple of weeks. And one day he made the mistake of making 2 transactions in the same day at different branches, but the bank aggregated and had to fill out a CTR. So they called him to get the information, name, address, date of birth, social security number, that whole thing. Actually, I take that back. Before they called him, they called me, because during the conversation, when they gave me this list of transactions in the branches where they occurred at the drive-up window, we were talking a little bit, and I almost forgot to ask the all-important, what's this guy do for a living question? And to this day, that remains an important issue, knowing and understanding the person's occupation or type of business. The 3 of us could do the identical transactions. It could be suspicious as all get out for me, but very explainable for you two, because it's not about the transactions, it's about where the money originated from. So I almost forgot to ask that all-important question, and I talked to her and said, can you tell me what this guy does for a living? Well, she said, that's what's odd. We think this guy works where they make this stuff. And I took the phone and I beat her on the desk a couple of times because I thought I had a bad connection. I said, would you repeat that, please? They said, well, we think he works at where they print the money. I said, you mean at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing? She said, yes. So we did some background and did as much as we could, couldn't find anything other than the fact that his payroll check came from the Department of Agriculture. And as a Treasury employee, my check came from the Department of Agriculture as well when I was an agent with IRS. Just had something to do with how the accounting was set up. I never did understand it, but I thought, well, it's a possibility. So we tried to do everything we could and couldn't find anything. And after a couple of days, I called the security at BEP and I talked to a guy who I knew. He was retired Secret Service. I said, Sam's not his name, but listen, I wanted to run something by you, but I want you to promise me that you won't tell anyone about this because I don't want the word to get out. So I tell him the story about what's happened and the fact that we think this guy's an employee at BEP. He finally said, what's his name? And I said, Sam Smith. He said, oh God, Sam's a great guy. One of the 5 most trusted employees in this place. He's an up and coming star. I said, well, your up and coming star has been really depositing a hell of a lot of cash. And it is concerning when he works where they make this stuff. But I knew, having been to BEP in the past, if you walk in there, you're subject to search on the way in and way out. If you're carrying a briefcase, they search the briefcase, whatever. I don't want to just go on because it's about a 20-minute story, but we eventually decided to execute search warrants on his car because he always went through the drive-through window, on his person because he could have things there. We got a call from another bank. He had a safe deposit box at that bank. His residence, at the end of this thing, we executed search warrants. And while we were executing search warrants, we had him come in for an interview, which he consented to. And this is another thing, explaining where the money came from. So we go through, what do you own in the way of cars, boats, airplanes, jewelry, furs, real estate, investments and things of that nature. And he went through everything, and we had determined that he spent a lot of money. But, there's always the possibility that you have money from a non-taxable source. And do you have any loans, any gifts, and inheritances? And he said, you're here to talk to me about the money that I got from my grandparents. I said, that might be it. Tell me about it. So he told us about how the money was in a safe in a log cabin up on the mountain someplace. And I said, is that the money that you actually took and have been depositing at the banks? He said, well, yeah. He said, that's exactly what it is. So I went over that story a couple times to make sure I had it right. I had about 50 pages of paper with bills, serial numbers on them. I said, well, I've got a little problem with your story, Sam, because we've been recording the serial numbers of all the bills you deposited. And the money you deposited was printed, because he said that this happened about 4 or 5 years ago, were printed by BEP 6 months ago. They were shipped to the Fed in New York and one to Republic National Bank. So your story really doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't fit. And he sat there and he thought for a little bit. He had another story, and his story was that an investor had contacted him and told him he knew where the market was weak and they could make a lot of money. And before this guy, Sam, sent him his $5,000 investment, the investor was sending him cash back in the mail and brand new $100 bills. With that, one of the agents that was doing the interview sat down her pad and pencil, and she said, it sounds like there's a lot of money to be made, and I'd love to talk to him as well. And finally said, well, I can't remember his name, but I've got his contact information in my office downstairs. And with that, I said, well, if that's the case, we'll find it, because we're executing a search warrant of your office as we speak. And he looked at me and he said, you are? And I said, yes, we are. I said, now, you told me there was nothing in the safe deposit box at the other bank. What was really in it? He said, cash. I said, how much? He said, a whole bunch. It was about $600,000. But the most amazing part of this story, I think, is that in his car, a 280 or 300 ZX parked on a public parking lot in Washington, D.C. was $670,000 in brand new $100 bills on a laundry bag. So I watched the news the next day to see how many car thieves jumped off the 14th Street Bridge in D.C., but there weren't any. But I was trying to rush through that, so I got things a little bit out of order. But I think you get the point that he couldn't explain the source of the money, tried to come up with a couple of stories that didn't work. But the importance of looking for these type transactions, it's not always going to be $800 or $900 or $9,900 in cash transactions or deposits. It's a matter of knowing and understand the customer and the customer relationship. And I think to this day, probably a lot of the best cases are developed from what's seen by frontline personnel. The other one, during my tenure with the bank, a guy deposited $100 million. So we do another one of these, I'll save that one for that.
You know, I found that the most amazing part of that story, Gary, and this is what makes Don such an incredible investigator. He was able to use his television remote control and make it work like a telephone. He didn't know that apparently Don was the inspiration for Maxwell Smart and the shoe phone.
Well, I could have used my shoe, but I had to take the phone out of the room. That's the best I had. Now you know why I was never an undercover.
God, that's great. Just do some final comments, just so that maybe young folks coming into the business and maybe some law enforcement moving into the business, just so they could hear this and see what three old schmucks are going to have to say for themselves. Any parting words of wisdom for the cast and crew?
I would encourage anyone who's at all interested working in law enforcement to pursue it, because I have to be honest with you, it was the greatest 26 years of my life. We had a ball. Part of it was the people we work with. Part of it was the work. Part of it was a combination of everything, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. It was great.
I totally echo what Don said. I did 34 years, and just so everybody knows, I started at a young age. They need an undercover operator in a kindergarten class, so that's why
That's it.
34 years, and I still look young. But yeah, look at law enforcement. But I'd also say anybody really interested in this field, get your cyber skills up. That's where this is all going. The days of looking at paper money, they'll be around for a while yet, but I believe in about 10 years, it's going to be everything digital.
Yeah. Gary, on your recommendation, I took a course with the blockchain. I remember when this first was coming out, when I was still on the job, and I'm thinking to myself, I don't want to spend the time, effort, and energy and money to learn it, because it may not be here for a while. It's just a fad. Make sure that you take the bull by the horns yourself. You just can't expect a job, whether it's law enforcement or whether it's in the private industry. You know, people can't take away your own education. And so just get the skills, and maybe you still don't get that job. Maybe someone else gets it yet. But sooner or later, you have all this knowledge and information they can't deny you. And what's the cost of some of this stuff? Certainly it doesn't cost much to be on the internet and read it and be a part of as many sites as you can, and read up on FinCEN, read up on Wolfberg, and read up on FATF, and white papers out there, different certifications available. That's a whole nother topic into itself someday, maybe we'll get into. Don't depend on anybody else. depend upon yourself to go ahead and move forward. With that, I'd just like to thank you guys. I've known these two guys for a long time and always enjoy when we get together, and it's a shame that we just got to do these things on Zoom these days. I look forward for when we can have a little quiet practice once again, like the old days.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for taking time out and doing this. So we'll put this up on the podcast, and it'll be up on the YouTube channel also. With that, thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Bud. Appreciate you asking us.
You guys are the best and appreciate it all. All right. Thanks, Don. Thanks, Gary.
Take care.
This has been Kevin Sullivan of the Anti-Money Laundering Training Academy at amltrainer.com. And that wraps up this episode of C Notes. Be on the lookout for the next episode of C Notes. And if you'd like to climb aboard this AML ride-along, please subscribe to the C Notes podcast. For those watching on video, click the logo in the bottom right of the screen to subscribe to the Anti-Money Laundering Training Academy's YouTube channel. And you can also pick up a copy of my book called Anti-Money Laundering in a Nutshell. It's available on Amazon or Barnes & Noble and at finer stores in most cities and at lousier stores in all cities. For all AML Academy services, custom on-site and online training, and a growing catalog of live and on-demand webinars, courses, please visit our website at amltrainer.com. And thank you for listening. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.